of you from across the world. We have many participants outside China. Thank you for joining the talk given by Professor Teun van Dijk. Professor van Dijk is legend in linguistics. Just to quote Professor Christian Matthewson's recommendation for this talk to his students and colleagues. Indeed, Professor van Dijk has made groundbreaking contribution to our understanding about language, how language and discourse shape and reflect social power dynamics. His work spans multiple disciplines, including linguistics, psychology, and social science, making him a very influential scholar in discourse studies. He contributes to the field of discourse studies not only with his profound insights, but also through his dedicated service to the community. He has been the founding editor for several top journals in discourse studies, including Text and Talk, Discourse and Society, Discourse Studies, and Discourse and Communication. Today, he will talk about his new book, Social Movement Discourse. I will leave it for Professor van Dijk to explain why we are so privileged to have his talk here. And also, despite his extremely tight schedule, Professor van Dijk has been very generous to allocate about 1 hour for discussion with the audience. So I strongly encourage you to stay attentive throughout the talk and prepare questions for the discussion. So for all the questions, please type it in the chat box. I shall now hand over the floor to Professor van Dijk, please.
Ni hao. Hi from Barcelona in Spain. As Professor Zhang already mentioned, my name is Teun van Dijk. I'm going to pronounce it again in Dutch so that you know how to pronounce it. Teun van Dijk. I am the founding director of the Centre of Discourse Studies in Barcelona, from where I am now speaking. It is a great honor to be able to talk about my new book, Social Movement Discourse. And I thank Professor Zhang for inviting me to give this talk. And I also thank her students, her MA students, for helping me to make a list of Chinese specialists in discourse studies. I can use these names to find reviewers of Chinese articles sent to the journals Discourse and Society, Discourse Studies, and Discourse and Communication. And these students are, and allow for my bad pronunciation of Chinese names, these are students He Yue, Li Xinglong, Lin Miaona, Lin Shi, Wang Xia, Wu Yanmin, and Xia Meiling. These students have helped me and have a fantastic list, and I'm using this every day for my work in for the discourse journals. And I'm now going to share my screen so that you can see my lecture. All right, you can see my lecture now. And
yes.
As you can see, I'm going to talk, as you also see, as it was announced, I'm going to talk about the discourse of social solidarity. That's the name of the book, and I already going to announce you that I'm beginning to work already on the next book, which is related to this book, and it will be out about the social discourse cognition. So this is about discourse, but the next book will be about cognition. And this book has, of course, several aims, and also my talk today has several aims. I am today briefly talking about the theories of social movements, specifically about theories and movements of solidarity, and specifically on the movement called Refugees Welcome. I will be talking about the role of discourse in social movements, and specifically also about the role of Refugees Welcome. I will briefly talk about genres of social movement discourse, and most of the time I will talk about the different structures of social movement discourse. So I will give some examples, but we probably won't have time to discuss all of them. But what I will try to put this talk, at least the PowerPoint, I will also put in the website of our center here in Barcelona. So those of you who have not been able to read all the text, and definitely I can not analyze all these examples, they can always have a look at them again. Social movement is an area, is in several disciplines, but mostly in sociology. And there have been a lot of traditions in these theories of social movements. There used to be, for a long time, a more social psychological mass psychology aspect, especially when we talk about the mobs of people who were afraid of these mobs. Then later, a more specific other approach was what is called the political opportunities theories, which actually is about a political context. For example, here in Spain, there is the feminist movement, and also the government is feminist, so that is very consistent, and that helps. Another direction of research is in social, especially on resource mobilization. So, for example, the people who help the money movements get, and so on. And since especially after the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you had also what were called the new social movements, which were different from the old movements, which were about, for example, about class relationships, like in the 19th and 20th century. And these new social movements are about feminism, anti-racism, and have more to do with identity. And within these last decades, there was this more cultural paradigm in social movements, which was not specifically about salaries and so on, but also about other things, like, for example, identity, emotions, discourse, and frames. Now, what happened a few years ago, when I was reading a lot about social movements, the method used by many people in sociology, they called it frame analysis. And when I was reading many of these articles, more and more, I was realizing that all these things they called frames actually are aspects of discourse. So I was getting more and more critical about this particular kind of analysis. And I said, why don't you actually read and use discourse analysis? So I wrote a critical article called Analyzing Frame Analysis, which was published last year in the journal Discourse Studies. And I invited people from different areas of the study of frames to comment about that. But then colleagues of mine said, yes, it's good for you to criticize all this frame analysis, but what would you do? So I felt inspired to think, now let me try to do it myself as well. So the main reason to write this book is that I wanted to show people in social movement studies that you can also use discourse analysis to do this book. So that my criticism of frame analysis was actually that particular reason to do the book. And when I talk about solidarity, I would like to repeat that there are different kind of social movements. So there is typically also movements of resistance against domination, repression, and so on, and marginalization. For example, the feminist and the anti-racist movements. But there are also movements of solidarity. And one of the major movements of solidarity, which I also studied in my book on the history of anti-racist discourse, is, for example, the whole movement of the abolition of slavery in many countries in the 19th century. So these are movements of solidarity. And when I started to write this book, I realized that I could talk about solidarity, but I didn't actually know what it was. So one of the main things I did starting to read about this book is also to explore theories of solidarity. And there are theories in the social science, in sociology, and so on. But also there's even a philosophy of solidarity. What exactly is this kind of solidarity? It means that people of one group or one community, for example, think about the interest, the goals, and the sympathy for another group. So if another group has problems or being repressed or marginalized and so on, then one group is helping or sustaining and supporting the other group. That is just one aspect of a very complex philosophical question of solidarity. For example, does it mean that you always are in agreement with all the people you want to help or not? That is not always the case. You may be in favor of their goals, but maybe not in favor of their methods. So the theory of solidarity are different philosophical positions, more radical ones and less radical ones. And radical ones will say, whatever the persons you are sympathetic wills do, you have to agree with them. And of course, not all people are agreeing with that. Solidarity, as I also show, is also one of the principles of the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union of December 20 of each year. Is also International Human Solidarity Day, recognized as an international observance, which I just read in Wikipedia. So there is solidarity is a very important international notion, which is in all society being used. And since I not only wanted to introduce different aspects of discourse and discourse analysis for people in social movement studies, most of them in the social sciences, I also wanted to use a specific concrete example. So what happened was that around 2015, suddenly many people, refugees, were coming from the Middle East, mostly also from Syria, coming to Western Europe. And what then happened was that many people wanted to help. They went to the borders, to train stations, and so on. And all these poor people who suddenly, without anything, because of political or wars, they were fleeing to Europe, and many people in Western Europe were motivated to go and help them in many, many ways. And that campaign was suddenly called Refugees Welcome. There was a whole, as they said in Germany, a whole welcome culture. So my next main topic and aim of this book was to study the discourses of and about this movement, Refugees Welcome. And I also would like to say that solidarity discourse has to do also with one of the aims of critical discourse studies, which is not only about domination and what is not about oppression discourse of all kinds, like racist discourse, for example, but also lately all kinds of discourse of resistance, of solidarity, and so on. And Professor J. Martin from Sydney in Australia has been mentioning this topic from a perspective what he called positive discourse studies. Now, if we think of these social movement genres, the first thing I wanted to know, if you study social movement, and the same is happening wherever you as colleagues or students want to do this, the first thing as a discourse analyst you would do is to say, now, social movements simply are not just demonstrations or activities in the streets and so on, but they are also very, very important in the social movement are also discourses. So part of a movement, like, for example, a demonstration, also banners and slogans and songs and leaflets and flyers and speeches, and people simply, you cannot imagine a manifestation, a demonstration, or anything like that, or an occupation of a square, like happened also in Occupy in New York and also here in Barcelona. It is not a silent kind of thing. Social movements are very much discursive. And that's and I just mentioned here a few of these genres, but one of the first things you have to do is to make a list of all the kinds of discourses involved in social movements. And of course, they are part of other activities, like, for example, occupations or demonstrations and whatever, walking in the street. But also you have independent discourse genres, simply are by themselves, are also activities. So these are genres, but at the same time, they are also social and movement activities, like, for example, manifestos, press releases, blogs and websites, and also meetings and assemblies. So many of the studies of social movement discourse of the last years have also to do with meetings and assemblies. And in discourse analysis, for example, this also means, for example, studies in conversation and analysis of how, for example, in these big assemblies, people change turns, you know, for raising your hand and all kinds of other things. So it is very interesting to see what kind of discourse you can study as part of social movements, and each of them you can specialize. Actually, I give you one example here. I just have to get away this thing, but I can't see text yet. Okay, here is a text of a manifesto. Manifesto are, let's say, the first kind of discourses you expect of a social movement. So if a movement is starting or changing a direction, you very often will have a manifesto. Actually, I also wrote a paper about this in a recent book, but here is just an example of a movement here in Barcelona called Stop Mare Mortum. And for those of you who don't know Latin, Mare Mortum means the Dead Sea in Latin. It was because thousands of people fleeing through northern Africa were drowning in the Mediterranean, coming to Italy and to Greece and other countries in Europe. So this movement was called Stop Mare Mortum to act very importantly to change European migration and immigration policies. Now let's just have a look at some aspects of this manifesto. This text and also the others I'm going to show, we have no time to analyze in detail, but you can do that always later in your own research. I give you some fragments of what I call a relevant analysis. Relevant analysis means that you only focus on the discourse structures which are relevant for the genre itself. For example, this is a manifesto, and manifesto has very specific aspects other discourses do not really have as a combination, so I'm going to focus on this. So, of course, after the name itself and a couple of slogans which summarize some of their activities, like raising awareness and being political advocates and mobilize the population, that are sort of slogans. The first question is the rhetorical question, who are we? Now, if you know about websites, many websites have this kind of question of who are we? It has to do with identity. And as I said, many of the aspects of social movements in this cultural paradigm of the last decades is also the question of identity. So the first question of this kind of thing is and so not only the question, the rhetorical question, who are we, but then we are a citizen platform and so on. So that is what they are defined as. So a social movement, the first thing they do is to represent themselves as what they are, their identity. And then you get another aspect very important for manifestos, that is their aims and goals. For example, that aims to promote change in European migration and immigration policies in order to ensure, that's another game, another aim, another goal. You see, this means that for this particular kind of discourse, you have to look at all the aims or goals, direct ones or more indirect ones, and so on. So that's another aspect of the relevant structure of a manifesto. And to ensure that human rights are guaranteed and respected, now we not only have identity, and not only we have goals and aims, but also the norms and values which are somehow relevant for them. So human rights is very important. Again, we are working to ensure, here you get another dimension of a social movement manifesto as a genre, namely the activities of the movement. So what they actually do, this movement Stop Mare Mortum, is we are working to ensure, and again, you have all that legal and safe access routes to European territory are established to prevent all deaths along the way. So you see the categories relevant are identity, aims and goals, and the activity of the movement. But there is something else. In the next paragraph, you see, as a platform, we believe in the unrestricted freedom of movement of all people and that human rights must be guaranteed without distinguishing between migrants and refugees. Now, the fact that they say as a platform, we believe and so on, it means that in the manifestos, also very important is the cognitive aspect. And I mentioned in the beginning that after this book, I'm not only interested in discourse, but in many other aspects of social movements, which are anything which has to do in the heads of people. It has to do also with cognition. It has to be with beliefs, with knowledge, with ideologies, with many things like norms and values, as I just mentioned. These are also very important in social movements and also very important in manifestos. So they have to formulate norms and values of this movement, namely the freedom of movement and so on and so on. And then it also says, without distinguishing between migrants and refugees, and as I said, all aspects of a discourse require analysis. And here, for example, without distinguishing between migrants and refugees, it presupposes something. It presupposes that other people, for example, heads of many governments in Europe, and at that moment, for example, David Cameron in England, make a distinction between refugees and what he called economic migrants. So when they say that, it at the same time, implicitly in this presupposition already say against which ideas they are also acting. And therefore they say, and then in this sense, we believe, again, a belief that the European migration policies and the unwillingness of the member state, the European Union and organization itself have become the biggest obstacle to live, etc., etc. You see that important of a manifesto is not only to tell who we are, what we want to do, what our norms and values are, and so on and so, but also who are our opponents. So there is already a polarization between us and them. You see, so now the interesting thing is that many years ago, I wrote a book on ideology. And what I found in the structures of ideologies, that there is a polarization between in-group and out-group. And the interesting thing is that the categories I then found many years ago of ideologies are very similar to the discursive categories in this manifesto and in many others as well. So there is a relationship between the discourse of a movement and its ideology. And that's very interesting because we find, and this is not this text, but I did analysis of several other manifestos, also of very different movements. And again, you find very similar categories. And these categories are also ideological categories. So you see that there is a relationship between fundamental ideologies, the way they apply to a specific attitude, for example, in this case about migration or refugees, and the actual discourse structures organized under the influence of the ideology. At the end of this text, you also see Stop Mare Mortum was born in late April 2015, and so in reaction to, etc., the death of nearly 1,000 people during the sinking of a boat they were hoping to reach the coast of Sicily. And so the first action was, and so many discourse manifestos also, movement manifestos also talk about the history of the movement. So this is typical of manifestos. Now, what they then did after this idea of different genres and giving one example of a genre, namely the manifesto as an example, in each chapter of the book, I started to study just one aspect of discourse, simply beginning with words. You have to remember, the book is not written for discourse analysts. The book is not specifically written for people in linguistics. So I had, in each chapter, I had to explain what things are all about. So I had to, for example, in this chapter on words, I have to say what are words? I had to mention, for example, the theory of, in basic linguistics, ideas of sign, for example, that a sign consists of signifying part and the signified part, the meaning and so on. I had to explain linguistics, let's say 100 years ago, beginning with Ferdinand de Saussure in France. But besides, of course, this is not an introduction to linguistics. So very quickly, I'm going to say now, what is relevant for us in discourse studies when we look at words? And what I did in this book, I found another book by a very famous scholar in social movement studies called Sidney Tarrow in the United States. He wrote a book, The Language of Contention. And that book is a very interesting book about the history of all kinds of keywords in the history of social movements. For example, I didn't know that one of the words, for example, studied was boycott. And that, for example, the notion of boycott was very relevant in the history of social movements. That's a book. The interesting thing, by the way, is that when I communicated with him about this book, Sidney Tarrow wrote me, unfortunately, in my own field, there is not much interest in this book. And I was really surprised because it's such an interesting book, because us as discourse analysts and linguists, we are of course interested in words. And he did an analysis using also Google, for example, which words in the history were so in the intellectual history of a movement, which words were typically used. Today we would of course use, in the old days in social sciences, they would use content analysis. Today, we use, of course, also corpus analysis for frequencies, collocations, and many other ways of doing these things. But now, not only after introducing the notion of word, I was also interested in what actually are the words used by the volunteers who went to stations and borders to help refugees. What I did was I did an analysis of Facebook posts, mostly in Norway and Sweden, and I wanted to know how people in Facebook wrote about helping refugees. And then after a systematic analysis of these Facebook posts, the type of notions I found are the following here in caps. Action, emphasizing that it's apolitical, it's sort of automatic, and of course the notion of cooperation, diversity, and of course the donation, but they donate, for example, clothes and so on, that it is always very emotional. It has to do with friendship, but also frustration that they cannot do more. And of course the notion of giving, that is also a question of gratitude. The notion of humanity comes up all the time. It's like human misery they want to. It has to do with independence. It's also a metaphor of open arms. It has to do with proximity, spontaneity, system, and so on and so on. Now, if you take all these are just individual words which frequently appear in different Facebook posts in different countries. Now, if you put these together, you can construe a sentence which basically is a description of what refuse welcome as a movement is. And of course, a content analysis or corpus analysis looks only individual words, but we are also interested in more actually proposition expressed in clauses and sentences. And then if you translate these words, you have the following sentence: an apolitical, independent, and unified action of volunteers engaged spontaneously, without thinking, in cooperation with many other organizations and in diverse groups, emotionally welcome proximate refugees with open arms and friendship, and consisting in donating and giving time and goods despite frustration or limitation of the system. Now, these keywords together put in a meaningful sentence is an excellent definition of the movement. And it's just one chapter on words. Now, of course, as linguists, we are interested in more than just words. And as you know, we are interested also in syntax. And as you know, as I mentioned here, the classical first book about this topic is his famous book by Roger Fowler, Bob Hart, Gunther Kress, and Tony True, a book in 1979, which actually for me, called Language and Control, which actually for me is the first book in critical discourse studies, because they began to look at language and specifically in that time, it was mostly limited to sentences, the structures of syntax. And they, for example, showed that specific actives or passives of sentences or nominalizations are ways to emphasize or disemphasize the active role of specific people. In my own work on racism in the press, I also found that, for example, if a newspaper wanted to mitigate the negative action of the police, they will put police in a passive sentence, not explicitly in the headlines. And black youth, they would put in the headlines. So there are ways in which the structure of language can emphasize or de-emphasize the positive or negative actions of social actors. That was a book of 79. If we look at books which are published now, for example, a book by someone also, Chris Hart, for example, edited a book called The Discourses of Disorder, Riots, Strikes and Protests in the Media. That book and other work, for example, of Chris Hart, shows how important the structure of news articles are, for example, to show, for example, the role of the police of people who are participating in demonstrations. Now, that part, all of you know who are in linguistic and discourse analysis. I looked at that aspect also in the articles in the press about these refugees welcome. And the interesting thing is, if you look at hundreds and thousands of sentences in the coverage about the social movement, you see that refugees never appear in subject positions of sentences where they are active actors of being in control of themselves. So as you can see here in headlines of The Guardian, in England, thousands of Germans have volunteered to help refugees. Again, refugees are just objects or patients of actions of European people, thousands of Germans. The European nation accepted the largest number of refugees in proportion to its population was Sweden. Again, the European nation that accepted answer again is the subject of this kind of thing. And other headline says the UK took 160 Syrian refugees. And again, we have a proud tradition of protecting refugees, said the Prime Minister at that time in England, David Cameron. Again, we in England, or my party, and so you see that typical from a linguistic, syntactic point of view is emphasizing the positive role of us in Europe, and refugees are always only, have a minor role, syntactically speaking. So that's just, I wanted to show people in social movement discourse, you can actually look not only at words, but also at the structure of sentences, or that helps you to do this kind of thing. All this, of course, in linguistics and in discourse analysis, but people in social sciences, they never or hardly ever look at the actual linguistic syntactic structure of sentences. Now, look at the semantics. Of course, again, semantics, as you know, is very important and beyond traditional ideas of just sentences and words. Of course, in discourse analysis, many, many years, we are also interested in global topics, themes, and so on, which I used to call semantic macrostructures. But also locally, the semantics is very important. We, for example, our study, for example, implications, I just mentioned presuppositions, and also at the link with pragmatics, also implicatures. So the many local structures also very important. And I just give an example here from how David Cameron, whom I already mentioned, talked about the same thing in a parliamentary debate about refugees welcome. He said, let me update the House, which is House of Commons, Parliament, on what we are doing to help address the migration crisis in Europe, and in particular, to help the thousands of refugees who are fleeing Syria. Now, this is nice, and again, we already had said that, of course, there is also this idea of that the in-group, we are helping. But look at the semantic structure. It says that what he is actually implying is that the UK or his government is contributing to the solution of the refugees. He doesn't say so, but he is actually implying this. So implication is very important in this kind of thing. And not only implication, but also, and precipitate, but also implicatives. For example, when he says, some are economic migrants in the same speech, in search of a better life in Europe, many are refugees fleeing a conflict. It is vital to distinguish between the two. Now, what is the implicature when he says that there are economic migrants on the one hand, and others are refugees fleeing conflict? He just makes a category distinction. And you remember the manifesto of Mare Mortum, and they were against making this distinction. That's exactly what David Cameron is doing here. So it doesn't semantically imply, but it does politically implicate that they can't admit economic migrants. Of course, he did not want to say that explicitly in that situation of crisis. But making this distinction implicates, pragmatically speaking, that England does not want to admit economic migrants. So this was showing people in the social sciences, and especially working on social movements, how important semantics is, and not only the general topics, of course, of all these discourses, but also locally already, this is very important. Let's see another aspect of semantics. For example, a couple of mayors in Europe, Ada Colau, who used to be a very famous mayor of Barcelona, a very fantastic woman who always was active in protecting people, for example, who were losing their house and apartments, and the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, and Spiros Galinos, a mayor in Greece. They together wrote a declaration, said that's another kind of discourse genre. By the way, I forgot to mention that not only when you study discourse genre, you should look at the structures of the discourse genre itself, but also to the communicative context. That's crucial to understand. It has to do with the pragmatics of discourse. Who is talking, when, where, to whom, with what kind of aims, with what kind of knowledge, and so on. That's the communicative context. Now, we, the citizens of Europe, the pronoun we, of course, you can only understand when you also know who is talking, when and where, and so on. So pronouns of indexical expressions or are very important as a reference to the aspects of the communicative situation. Now let's look at a brief part of this declaration. Europe's credibility is currently at stake. So you see the major problem beginning, first line of this text is the problem is not directly the death of many refugees, but the credibility of us here in Europe. It says also, we, the city of Europe. We cannot remain indifferent while death stalks our beaches daily, while thousands of families fleeing war in Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia crowd our ports, stationed trains and roads waiting for a humanitarian response from Europe. This isn't about charity. This is about guaranteeing a human right, the right of asylum. That was a declaration in September 13. It was the so-called hot summer of refugees. Now, look at the semantic aspects of this kind of thing. So happening is the main topic here is especially the question of what it has to do with our identity. It has to do with the credibility of Europe. It has to do with we as mayors responsible for politics in Europe and so on. So if we say we cannot remain indifferent while death stalks our beaches, what's the implication? We mayors are not indifferent, which implies and also implicates that we as politicians at the left in Europe are very good people. You know, while thousands of families fleeing. So, and then with the use of numbers, which is very typical in this kind of messages, you know, the numbers game is very important when you want to emphasize the serious problems of refugees, you will always use many numbers. And you'll also have lists, like, for example, Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, and you have another list, ports, stations, trains, and roads, and so on. These accumulated lists are very important to emphasize specific kinds of discourses in this case. So this is, on the one hand, a semantic aspect of what does it imply, but it also has a rhetorical aspect about which we also want to very briefly also, I would like to talk about style. Again, each chapter of the book takes a different aspect of typical discourse analysis. Today, very prominent. Of course, there are many other aspects of discourse, but style, of course, is important. Now look at, for example, again, about refugees, but now not a talk of a social movement, not talks of mayors in different cities, but also of an official refugee convention of the United Nations. And the style is as following: no contracting state shall expel or return, and then it adds refouler, a French word, a refugee in any manner whatsoever to the frontiers of territories where his life, in those times, this is 51, they didn't say yes, his and her life or their lives, but anyway, his life or freedom would be threatened on account of his race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, political group. So this is a very formal way of saying these kinds in the internets and the conventions. And actually they make use of a French word, refouler, and simply expel or return. So you see that you can use specific technical words like the principle of non-refoulement in French as parts of the international discourses about these refugees. So I just want to say and show people in social movements that you can look at different kinds of discourses about refugees, and they also have a different style. One is much more formal, with words you would not use in everyday language. Now, if you look then at, for example, The Guardian, they say in the headline, revealed 2,000 refugee deaths linked to illegal EU pushbacks. So the notion of pushback is much more concrete, much more embodied, much less formal than refouler or simply expel or return. You know, and the Guardian analysis, as they said, find EU countries use brutal tactics to stop nearly 40,000 asylum. You see, again, all these numbers. And because The Guardian is a left-wing newspaper and not exactly on the same political line as David Cameron of the Conservative government, so they are going to emphasize the negative opinion with some aspects like, for example, brutal tactics and so, which are already much less formal than, for example, to expel or to return or even refouler. So you see that the newspaper is actually already, it's still newspaper language, but it's already much more concrete. It's much more embodied. It has to do with brutal tactics. It has to do with pushbacks, you know, and not just refusing people to enter. Now, if you then look at how actual volunteers talk about these particular kind of things, again, it's much less formal. It tell everyday stories about which we'll talk a little bit later. A woman says in interviews, volunteers in England did with a colleague of mine in England, a French colleague called Pierre, and he interviewed women who were doing volunteering work in France. And she says, I've always done volunteering. I've always done charity work from when I was at school. I've always been that sort of person that want to help. And so it's just a very brief example of the very informal way people also talk about refugees in their everyday interviews with sociologists. Of course, I already mentioned rhetoric, and of course, rhetoric generally is about how discourse emphasizes or de-emphasizes specific kinds of things, especially also on the control of ideologies. We already meant the use of numbers and so on, and just have an idea how in Parliament, and this is translated from Spanish in Spain, how people at that time talked about this kind of thing. Just look at the way people do that. Regarding the refugee case, I will make a single reflection. It is obvious that this is a very complicated issue, very complex and difficult to answer. I think that the worst thing we could believe is that it can be solved with the brushstrokes of a demagoguery and opportunism, playing irresponsibly with people's lives and pain. And we will be wrong, ladies and gentlemen, if we do not act together, all the administration and all the social entities jointly. Okay, so this was a progressive speaker in Spanish Parliament, and you can look at all aspects of rhetoric. Rhetoric, of course, a huge discipline with many aspects, but you can see here that typical figures of speech in rhetoric are very important, like, for example, exaggerating king, and, for example, repeating aspect. For example, he's saying a very complicated issue, and then he says very complex and difficult to answer, and then the worst thing we could believe is answered. So he is using all kinds of things, like, for example, metaphors. When he says it can be solved with brushstrokes of demagoguery, and so see, this particular kind of metaphors again are ways to emphasize the seriousness of the situation. This gives you an idea that parliamentary debate is specifically very useful to see also the rhetorical aspect of talking about refugees. Another aspect very important in discourse analysis is, of course, argumentation. Of course, there's a whole discipline today called argumentation studies. And he gives an example here from Amnesty about global refugee crisis in 2015, at the end of 2015. And they write, Amnesty is calling for a dramatic shift in the way the international community deals with the global refugee crisis from 2016. Okay, it's calling for, actually, it's also a pragmatic aspect, but it's a speech act of, you know, of inviting or forcing or, you know, international politicians to change their refugee policies. And they say, they give an example why they are calling it this way, of their speech act of calling politicians to pay more attention. So they say, in January, Lebanese authorities closed their borders to refugees from Syria and imposed increased restrictions on 1.1 refugees already in Lebanon. A stark reminder that the international community must do help overwhelmed host countries and so on. Now, if you are in argumentation study, I wanted to show that you cannot just say, oh, this is a question of, for example, pathos, which many people in more simple analysis of argumentation. There is also a very specific way you can analyze this text in specific schemas of argumentation. So I showed that, for example, in this way. So the continuation of this is that you say you can distinguish this whole text in a fact, like Lebanon already has 1 million refugees, another fact. Lebanon is closing borders with refugees. So that's part of the text. And then there's another fact, but that's implied. It doesn't say in the text, but you have to infer it from your knowledge of the world, namely that Lebanon is a small country. It doesn't say so, but in an argumentation, that's implied that when Amnesty writes this particular kind of thing, they assume that readers of this text know that. And there's another fact there, namely that the fact 1, that they already have 1 million refugees, and the implied fact 3, that Lebanon is typically overwhelmed with refugees. If a small country already has more than 1 million refugees, of course, that's another fact. And that, again, there's another presupposed fact, namely that the international community is not doing enough. Because if the international community would help, Lebanon would not have the problem. So together with a general norm of international relations, namely that the international community must help small countries facing this emergency, and a couple of other combinations that if a small country is overwhelmed with refugees, then the international community must do more and must help it. And then the opinion of the statement of the argumentation is, all these things together is, the international community must do more to deal with the global refugee crisis, help overwhelmed countries. You see, you can analyze an argumentation in all kinds of steps in a systematic kind of analysis, not just a brief comment of the argumentation. Of course, it's also storytelling. There's no time to do a detailed analysis of stories, but to give you just an idea of another interview with Pierre Montfort, I already mentioned, and I'm very much in debt to he made available to me many of the interviews he did with volunteers, English people in France, and I analyzed and read many of the stories and accounts these volunteers were telling. Now, give you an idea just about storytelling and accounts. They are not like stories like, for example, studied in narrative studies many years ago. For example, when Bill Above in sociolinguistics studied stories in the United States after asking people, were you ever afraid to die? These are not this particular kind of stories with the usual introduction, complication, resolution, and so on categories. They are more like accounts, but they are stories anyway. But give you an idea what kind of story volunteers tell when you go and help people. So I just by chance came across a Facebook group called, and then the name of the organization, which is not mentioned, and it was just, again, just after the pictures of Alan Kurdi in the newspaper. That was a picture in the newspaper of a child who had drowned and was lying on the beach. And that person was called Alan Kurdi around the time. But so the week or two before was on the front of newspaper. There was a lot of media about all the boats that crossing the Mediterranean and stuff. So it became quite common knowledge. It was in the media, and I thought it was awful. And I remember seeing a documentary. I cannot remember what it was. And it was just one part of it where a guy had gone across to Calais, and he was in his car. And he was giving bottles of water to refugees who were walking down the train lines, just passing them through the fence. And I thought, I could do that. And when I saw this, and I saw that before, saw the Facebook page, then I saw the Facebook page, and I thought, I clicked on it, and I said, I could do that. And then it just completely snowballed from there during the Facebook group, which grew very rapidly in a few weeks. And a few weeks after we'd opened the Facebook page, we were going down to front. So it was quite incredibly, really. You see, this is a story how someone became involved as a volunteer. It's like an account what happened, and you see that it has specific kinds of structures. It has to do with the emotions, it has to do with the abilities of people, it has to be a description of the context. It is a very detailed account for how people become members of social movements. And that for us, that's not only interesting as an analysis of some kind of narrative, but also for people interested in the theory of social movements. This gives you evidence of how people become members of social movements. That's a very important part of the theory of social movements, this whole question of how people enter and become a part of social movements. And the stories and accounts of this, for example, this particular kind of person is like this. And of course, despite all these different kinds of structure of discourse, again, for discourse analysts and people in linguistics, they are very well known. But I wanted to present in the book for people in the social movements what kinds of things you can study. Now, of course, we also, in another chapter, there's another chapter on pragmatics, which I'm not showing. But there's also a chapter on multimodality. And of course, also pictures are very important. Now, as many of you know, but people in social movement studies don't know, is that, of course, pictures are also very important. And not only text in the newspaper about the movement of refugees welcome, but also many pictures. Now, have a look to finish have a look at this picture. For example, this is a picture of a manifestation in Barcelona, here in Barcelona, where I live, with the main text in English on a big white cloth they are carrying, and also a text in Catalan saying "Volem vies legals y segures," which you'll find also in the manifesto I showed you. We want legal and secure ways of coming, for example, to Europe. Now, look at this thing. And of course, there are many things you can say about the picture. It's obviously in a city, how you know, because you have houses on the left and on the right, and it's also a road you see, and so on. So already you see that according to the picture, a manifestation, a demonstration is an activity in a city. That's already very important. And of course, there are not walking all people taking the whole road itself. Again, that's not typical of walking in the street. It is typical of a demonstration. And people also have a big banner with a big name on it, which identifies their movement and also what the movement actually wants. You remember, important is identity and what we want, our aims and goals, and so on. And also, you see that people have different. You see also that there are no leaves on the tree. So this is typically in winter, as you can also see in the clothes of people. So, and also people are actually looking at each other, but they don't look at the photographer. You see, there is no interaction. They are interacting among themselves as a movement, talking as a demonstration, but there is no direct relationship with the photographer. In other pictures in the book, I sometimes, for example, in the cover of the book itself, they look actually at the photographer. Now you can say many other things, of course, about the colors and actually the colors of the clothes and so on. There's another thing which I found interesting. Why would a photographer pay so much attention to the street itself? It takes nearly half. There's a frame, as they say, which is very important. Why is this the street itself as such a big part of the picture? Why not only the people? Exactly. So you can try to explain it, and then you come to the question of interpretation of meanings. But my interpretation was that walking on the street has to emphasize a demonstration is crucial, not just people together saying something or communicating something, but it's something that happens in the street of a city. So the street is very, very important. That is what people do. They walk in the street. You see also their feet. So the question of walking in the street is crucial of this kind of demonstration. So these were the kinds of things I wanted to emphasize also in my book and also in the lecture. And that is also what I would like to show to you as given a summary of the chapters in this book. Thank you very much for listening to me about this. Let me just go back to. All right, thank you very much for listening to me. You now have an idea about this book. What I, of course, hope is that not only it's being sold here in Europe, elsewhere, but I also hope it will be translated also. Actually, it is now being translated also in Portuguese, so it will be published also in Brazil, in Portugal. And what I especially hope with this book is not only talk about refugees welcome, but also to show to people in the social sciences, and especially also in social movement studies, that discourse analysis in a systematic way can replace what they have been using for a long time, namely frame analysis, which is very vague because you can, with one frame analysis, describe many different things. And in discourse analysis, we prefer to do a more systematic analysis, all these kind of things. Again, the book is only an introduction, so it is not specializing in anything of syntactic analysis, narrative analysis, argumentation analysis, and so on. It is just an introduction for people in social movement studies. And that's what I wanted to present to you today. Thank you so much for listening to me. Shasha.
Thank you very much, Professor Van Dijk, for this very insightful and inspiring talk. When I was listening to it, I feel like I am listening to a walking AI who's working ChatGPT 5.0, who's mapping out, the interconnection between linguistic studies and among other disciplines of social sciences. So thank you very much for the talk. And I think, I hope the Chinese version, the translator of the Chinese version of this book, most probably will be one of our participants. Yeah, and our attendants or the participants, the audience have already got a number of great questions for you in the chat box. So could you please, the first one is Dr. Kurdistan Ravkoi. Can you read his question?
I'm now looking at the chat. The first one I see is by Rongetan. I see, wait a minute. Do you want me to have a look at each of? Okay, dear, you are more than welcome to type your question. I'd say already. Oh, that's of course what was part of that. And then the first question is from Kurdistan Rafik from Kurdistan. What's the difference of solidarity and political advertisement in developing and corrupted countries?
Yes.
Obviously, the notion of solidarity is complicated because therefore also you have a whole philosophy. And then, of course, the question, as I already said, is it can be contradictory. So, for example, you can be solidary, for example, with things which happen terrible, like, for example, today in Gaza as well. But at the other side, you can say, yes, this is kind of happening, but, solidarity is always a complicated kind of thing. It's not just one clear, transparent kind of thing. You can say, okay, we are now solidary with refugees, for example, in Europe, but also in a small country like Holland, for example, we cannot simply receive 1 million or 2 million refugees. So it's always yes, but. So, and the same thing, if things happen, as you say, in, corrupted countries, you can be solidary with questions of inequality, with oppression, with marginality, but also you have to take into account other kinds of things. So solidarity is a complex analysis, and for each situation, like any event now in the world, you have to do an analysis of what is happening. I mean, who are in power and who are abusing of their power. And for example, critical discourse analysis did not talk so much about this notion of solidarity until later. And in my book on, for example, the history of anti-racist discourse, I analyzed in detail centuries of discourses about, for example, abolition of slavery. And all these things have to be questioned. For example, people said to me in my analysis of people criticizing slavery, but at the same time, they didn't want to abolish it in earlier centuries and so on. So it was like a humanitarian, it was looking like a humanitarian legitimation of slavery. So it is difficult in many situations to be very clear about what you are criticizing with what you are agreeing. Not each thing requires an analysis. There's also a question from some in Pakistan. Can you share your views on how digital technologies have changed the dynamics of social movements these days? Are the implications of organizing activism and the implications of discourse analysis where actors and agencies are all very complex? Yes, I don't have to do a detail because other people are specialized in how digital means like the social media and so on, using, of course. When I started to do this work in the 80s, I only had a photocopier to copy articles from the newspaper. Today, my students can download the corpus of thousands of texts in 1 hour. So, of course, it makes a big difference. And of course, also the social media have an enormous influence today of all these kind of things. For example, Europe, we next week have our European elections. And because of the social media being influenced also by the extreme right, many people are very much afraid that the extreme right may gain many seats in European Parliament. And many people are blaming also the social movements because of that. So there is no doubt, Salma from Pakistan, that these digital technologies are changing dynamics in general, also the social movements, because again, you have social movements, for example, like the examples from Facebook I was mentioning, people motivating others to go and help refugees, but at the same time, you also have Facebook posts which are against immigrants and so on. And many of my students also do this particular kind of analysis with this Facebook things. Another question is from someone who says the impact of ideology and solidarity between the national movement, especially extreme ideology. As I mentioned of the example of the manifesto, all discourse of social movements is ideological discourse. There is always something. It is racist or anti-racist, feminist or anti-feminist, nationalist or anti-nationalist, and so on. Social movement discourse is essentially also ideological discourse. And if you do a systematic analysis of these discourses, you can, by inference, also reconstruct the underlying ideology in controlling these kind of things. And as you know from the theory I've been publishing in many articles and books now, it's not a direct relationship between discourse structures and ideological structures, because discourse structures have to do with one person talking, so it has to do with the individual personal mental models of a person, and that individual mental model of a person of a social event, for example, the arrival of refugees, is controlled by a shared social attitude about refugees. And the shared social attitude about refugees is, for example, controlled by an anti-racist ideology. So you have, at the very bottom, you have knowledge of refugees. That's the bottom is always knowledge in the system. I'm going to explain that in my next book on social movements. The basic is always knowledge. In specific knowledge community, epistemic communities, there are different kinds of interests, and you have ideological groups, for example, racist or anti-racist or nationalist and so on. And they control specific kind of attitudes, for example, about immigration, and that will influence individual people's mental models and their opinions. And that appears in discourse. So between ideology as a basis and the actual discourse structure, there are many levels in between. So that is what you need, a whole complex theory. Professor Zhang herself also had many questions. There is another question. How do we define different kinds of social movements? For example, this climate movement, one of social movements. Yes. In many social studies of social movements also say what social movements are. Some people call them like this. For example, my books on anti-racist discourse, I identified also a movement which I called of anti-racism in the same, and I compared it also with the movement of feminism in many countries, and I called it a macro movement, because anti-racism as a macro movement, because it is international in many countries, and it is expressing itself in many more specific or local movements. So, for example, the civil rights movement in the United States is also part of this anti-racist movement, but later Black Lives Matter in the United States today is also a more specific movement, part of the macro movement of of anti-racism. And for example, here in Europe, in France, and in Spain, you have also SOS Racisme. And again, it's a more local version of the global macro movement of anti-racism. And the same thing happens with other kinds of movements and so on. So then, for example, if a couple of citizens here in the city are protesting against the police, for example, getting people out of an apartment because they didn't pay the rent, would you call that a movement? Again, it would be just one-time event. But if this being repeated, and for example, the ex-mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, was head of this movement against this particular kind of removing people from their houses, then one event being repeated and more organized and may have a leader and it has a website and so on, then it becomes slowly a social movement. So there's not one definition, but a couple of criteria of continuity in time, a bit of organization, how to get new members, having some kind of manifesto, maybe some kind of website, and so all these things together are part of the social movement. And again, today, with, as I already mentioned, all kinds of digital aspects, compare the social movements of workers in the 19th century, of course, is very much different, but it has to do, of course, with causes of specific kinds of problems in societies, of suffering, and so on. I have another question. How can solidarity movement be examined in religious texts? Dr. Stewart asks Dr. Stewart in Nigeria. Well, yes, so solidarity movement in religious texts also. I am not a specialist in this topic, but I'm sure that in religious texts, and many actual movements are also religious. I mean, in history, as I just mentioned, for example, in my own books on social movement, on anti-racist discourse, which is basically in history, most of the earliest studies against slavery were actually religious people in many countries. That was the case, of course, in Mexico. It was the case in Brazil and many other countries. So there have always also be. And now I give you another example. My next book, I hope, which I'm not just preparing to read, will be about social movement cognition, right? And also there, I want to use a specific kind of movement, and I decided to study a movement which I was interested in already as an adolescent, which is the anti-militarist movement. So which is part of bigger movement of peace movements. And anti-militarist movement says, why do we need military? If we would not have military, we would not have wars. We would save much lives and much money and so on and so on. So I was very much interested in not being in favor of military. So for my next book, I'm going to take the international movement against military, which is also very old. And I am specifically interested in this particular kind of thing. And the last book I'm reading is specifically a book of interviews with people who are against military. And it's a book in another country. And the person who organized this is part of a Catholic movement against the military and so on. So again, there are many examples where social movements are related also with military and also military motivation of participating. So if you read interviews with people participating in movements, very often you have as a motivation also religious criteria. Let me see if there's another question. Just a second. Is there an interaction data in social movement? How can we approach the interaction data from CDA perspective? Can we combine the lens intermesh? Yes, what I have not done, apart from a bit of the pragmatics and the interviews, the only thing I studied was, for example, the interaction between the interviewer and a volunteer. But what should be done? I also mentioned there is bibliography and social movement studies about how, for example, people participate in meetings, for example, in assemblies, and how turn taking in taking the floor in assemblies takes place, for example, by raising hands and repeating what other people have said when there's no a microphone. So it's called the people's microphone. There are all kinds of doing conversation analysis also, and also people in other countries have done that. What I'm interested in, and the kind of data I never found, is what happens if people, before this kind of demonstration I mentioned in the talk, if people talk among themselves, they were actually, you see them walk and talk together. What happens if before they go there, what do they tell themselves? What kind of conversational interaction happens in a movement before they go into demonstration? So I would very much be interested in this kind of thing. If they walk in the demonstration, what kind of things do they take about? So these kind of data, of course, are not very easy to find because you have to record it or participate yourself and so on. Yes, there is very much in need also in social movement studies of this particular kind of micro data about how social movements are being enterized. Let me see another question. What's the concept of this groups and the definition of this is the definition of discourse is the whole discipline of discourse studies, and all these things which have to do with text, talk, written, spoken, signed, on the internet, any form of language use. So all that is part for me of discourse. And with all these properties discourse have at all levels of discourse, from sounds to movements, multimodal aspects of embodied and so on and so on. I would need another hour at least to summarize all the aspects which are relevant for the definition of discourse. But again, it is any kind of discourse analysis to this particular kind of thing. Let me see if there's another question. Thank you for your presence. Thank you also for that. Thanks. Jan said social movement as genres. No, social movement is not a genre. I'm only talking about discourse genre. Social movement is some kind of social collectivity. You only have many kinds of social collectives. You have armies, and you have classrooms, and you have people together, all kinds of things. You have a meeting in a theater, and so there are many kind of collectives of people, and the collective of people of social movements have to do with, as I define also the manifesto, it has to do with identity, it has to do with what people have to get, with people share as an identity, specifically also specific attitudes, for example, about immigration or refugees, and it has to do with aims, it has to do with activities, and it has to do with norms and values. And these categories are also the standard categories of theory of ideology. So there's a relationship between the structure of ideology and the structure of the movement, and that is also very interesting. Let me see if there's all the kind of things. People are interested in the Centre of Discourse. Discourse is where I am here. Actually, I'm actually sitting at home, but behind me, it's the Centre of Discourse Studies. The Centre of Discourse Studies, I found it 7 years ago in 2017. I was retired, and I did not only want to work in the university. So I found it in Barcelona, the first international Centre of Discourse Studies, which as a main aim has to educate also online PhD students interested in discourse studies from several disciplines, not only linguistics or communication, but also in psychology and sociology and so on and so on. And since in Europe we do have a general program of MA studies, but many universities, also in Spain, don't have actual detailed programs of PhD studies. So many students are actually working alone at home and don't have any help. So we have advanced seminars now also online for people in Spanish in Spain and Latin America, and maybe next year also in English. We hope in the future to organize many more activities also online for international talks and lectures and courses in discourse study, specifically for PhD students, because we can, of course, not talk for everyone, but many people who study discourse analysis for the PhD, we hope to be able to help. Let me see if there's more things here. Yes, there's a question, there's more a theoretical question also in discourse analysis, how to relate some Teun A asks, is how can you relate more micro analysis of sentence structures to more global structures of discourse, like for example narrative structures and argumentation structures, and that's precisely one of the aims of discourse studies since the 1960s and 70s, to relate these particular kind of things. So when local meanings somehow get together in sequences, we had this notion of semantic macro structures, as I defined them many years ago in the book, which is a global meaning of the text. And the global meaning of the text can have a specific kind of function. For example, it can be the introduction of, or the summary of a text and so on. Somehow this related to other structures like schematic structures or superstructure of discourse. And again, these can be part of what you call, for example, the genre of a scholarly article or an everyday conversation, or for example, storytelling. So we need, and we have today, detailed ways of relating local structures of words, sentences, sentence structure and syntax, and local sentence semantics, and how these are related to the more global structure of discourse. And much of my earlier work has been about that particular kind of relationship, which you can find, those of you, by the way, who want to see more of my work. Last year I renovated my website. Many of my articles about many of these topics, also on ideology, are on my website, and also many books. Let's see if there's other questions. A question of whether, for example, CDA needs to find common grounds between different parties in order to promote understanding. For example, between pro and anti-vaccination groups and so on. Well, it depends. If there are debates about various ways of reforming the city, as for example happens here in Barcelona, you can imagine that CDA can also have a part in that particular kind when there are specific kind of protests and when there are different interests involved. But it does not mean for me, and I'm very clear about that, that on the one hand, for example, we find an agreement between racist and anti-racist people. That is not true. Or between, for example, machista people, you like men who oppress women on the one hand, and feminists, no. So this does not mean that CDA is trying to get an agreement between people who abuse of their power. So power abuse has to be, in my view, and my view also of critical discourse study, has to be condemned always. We do an analysis of these kind of things, and we analyze how these forms of power abuse are activated also in discourse, and also how it is resisted in anti-racist feminine discourse. But we are not trying to find an agreement between people who abuse of their power and oppress other people. That is not what we talk about. And at least that's not my view. what we can try, but that's a different kind of thing, that by analyzing the discourses of racist people, and if we can show the kind of negative consequences this has for people and the country and so on and so on, and also for themselves, that we can maybe have a role in trying to change the minds of people who have these particular kind of terrible ideologies related to forms of oppression and so on. But I don't see critical discourse studies as a way of relating people who fight forms of abuse of power with people abuse of power. Abuse of power should, in my view, only be critically analyzed, at least from my point of view. Let me see if there's other things. How do you think about the differences between, ask May, between discursive governance and discursive domination? Actually, I have read a little bit in political science about discursive governance and so on, and discursive domination. This domination is a summary for my notion of abuse of power. And I have a book on discourse and power, and so how power and power abuse is defined is clear in that book and many of the articles. And discursive governance is important also in the following way, that last week I was a member in a committee, a PhD committee in Prague in the Czech Republic. It was about how people in parliament in Hungary and in the Czech Republic and Slovakia were talking about immigration and refugees and so on. And I was realizing that in political science, much less than in discourse studies and linguistics, people in political science don't actually realize very often that practically everything of politics is text or talk. It is all kinds of laws are the definition of parliament, as the word parler, and in Catalan parlar también, says of what a parliament is. So politics is practically always text or talk. So if you talk about discursive governance, also it should be realized that these are not only political actions and political activities and political structures, you know, like question of domination or legitimation and so on, but that most of the things going on there is also actually forms of text and talk. And understanding this is very important. And not only that, because in my work, as many of you know, I always have more or less a sort of triangle relating discourse structures with social structures, for example, of racism or anti-racism, but also with cognitive structures. So discursive governance also is not just text or talk, but also ideology. It has to do with knowledge. It has to do with norms and values, things which are in the head and which I hope to study in more detail also in the book on social movements. So actually, we should not only talk about discursive governance, but also about cognitive governance, what happens in the head of the politicians. And that also is very important. And there is, of course, work on the ideology and social and political sciences about this particular kind of thing. Another question, let me have a look. Multilingual content, is there a way to take multilingual content for the Yes, of course, multilingual content, of course, is extremely important. Many of the internet, for example, one aspect of social movement studies is also how social movements relate with social movements in other countries, and how, for example, the same movement, which can be an anti-racist movement or a feminist movement, or, for example, this specific kind of refugees welcome movement, they were participating many people. And also, actually, what we did not study is the way these volunteers actually talked with refugees. And these refugees were mostly speaking, for example, in Arabic and other country and other languages. So, of course, a multilingual context of people in England going to France and then talking to refugees, most of them who speak Arabic or maybe also English, of course, also is a multilingual context, which also should be taken in. And the question of multilinguality and so on is not only a question of discourse and language use, but again, also a cognitive thing, like different cultures and different notions, norms, and values and ideology. And of course, that, of course, is also very important. Let me see. Self-education and word activist creative term and schools type, would you consider a public speech in front of the world informal? If one person, like for example, you mentioned Greta Thunberg in Sweden and then internationally participates, she is one person who is an important voice for an international movement of an environmental international macro movement. It's international, it's many years already, and she is just a very important voice. But again, she's just one person. You should not confuse one person or leader in an of a movement with others. But another aspect of movement analysis is the role of leaders. And she is one of these very important leaders, and it makes sense as part of social movement studies also to study how these leaders talk and how they influence other people, how their norms and values are being shared by others, and how actually leadership works. And so leadership is also part of this particular kind of thing. I think we have, let me have seen, there's a difference between social movement and mobilization. Is there a question between social movement discourse and mobilization discourse? Social movement discourse is any discourse related to social movements, and one of them is to get other people to join, and that will be a question of mobilization, or when they protest in a specific event, for example, during a demonstration. All these discourse, the discourse at home, in the center of the social movement, in their website, in blogs, and so all these discourse together are discourse of social movement. And mobilization is just one of them. It's one genre of social movement discourse, like a manifesto is, or for example, a meeting or an assembly. All these are genres of social movement discourse, and you should not only analyze them, as I've shown in the talk, different structures of different levels, like from grammar to narrative, argumentation, and so on, and move. But also, for example, you should have a look, for example, at the communicative context. Today, also for my PhD students, I recommend not to begin directly with the analysis of discourse, discourse structures. Begin with a detailed analysis of the communicative situation, which is part of the broader social political situation. Talk with who is talking, to whom, with what kind of view, what kind of knowledge, what kind of aims, what kind of ideology. That first. Many people have said, we don't want this kind of context analysis. We want to have a look directly at talk or text. This is, I think, a limitation. You don't really understand text to talk if you do not understand the context itself. That's why in my books on context, I also introduced the notion of context models. It means as soon as you talk in a demonstration or a classroom or with family members at home and so on, you constantly in your head, you have a mental model of the communicative situation, where you are, when, with whom, and for whom you are talking, and so on. And many of the aspects of the discourse are adapted to that particular communicative situation. That's the notion of indexicality, which is absolutely crucial in any kind of discourse analysis, which also people in anthropology have been emphasizing for many years. Let me see if this other thing that info only on this or see. Social movement, this is just the last question, also of Professor Zhang, is is it not limiting if you look at social movements? My question is that my motivation was many people in social movement are studying, especially in the cultural paradigm of the last decades, they actually are studying discourses, but they don't do it with help of 50 years of discourse analysis, which is a shame. Instead of using notions of discourse, they use notions like frame and frame analysis, which are very specific notions in linguistics and cognitive linguistics and other disciplines. But if you use one notion, frame, for anything in discourse, of course, that's not a very precise kind of analysis. And therefore, my motivation to write this book was, look, we in discourse analysis and discourse studies in many disciplines, also in sociology, you can contribute to the analysis of social movements. But that's just one kind of thing. In the same thing, I've been studying many years. I have a book also on media, for example, on news and news analysis. I've been studying discourse, also of racist discourse and anti-racist discourse. Discourse analysis has to do with many kinds of discourse and have been studied since the 60s in many studies, in many books, handbooks, introduction, and so on. Discourse is about any kind of discourse, and that's why it is also broader than just linguistics. Linguistics can focus only on specific linguistic structures, but many aspects which are also relevant in discourse are not so much studied in linguistics, and therefore discourse studies is typically multidisciplinary. Much of the work I did for this book was in social sciences, social movements. I've been working a lot on also the cognitive aspects of discourse comprehension in psychology, and these notions I'm going to apply in my next book on social movement cognition. So I'm really interested and communicate and inviting students to look beyond one discipline. People in social sciences and social movement studies to look also in discourse studies, and people in discourse studies to look also in the social sciences and start, for example, studying social movements or anti-racist discourse or feminist discourse, or today, for example, discourse on the environment, which is again a huge field of analysis. So all these disciplines go together, and my way of doing it is to do a detailed analysis of discourse, a detailed analysis of the social situation, for example, about the environment or about racism and so on, or about the arrival of refugees, and relay this through what happens here. The knowledge people have, their ideologies, their norms and values, their goals, and so on. So together these things give you a multidisciplinary view of the discourse study, and that is also what I wanted to communicate to you today. These are more or less the questions which were in the talk here in the chat, and that's also how I would like to finish this communication with you. Also, thanking you for listening to me and being patient with my not very fluent way of talking. I always prefer to talk right away with people in the same room, and although we had to learn since the pandemic also to communicate in this way, but I'm grateful that you, wherever you are listening to me, and thank you for the question, especially thanking you for participating in this event, and thanking especially again Professor Zhang for organizing it and her students for helping me with my work. Thank you, Professor Zhang.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Van Dijk, for this really inspiring and also thought-provoking talk. And I would like to very briefly wrap up. Just now, some of the audience put their comments like this is like having an encyclopedia talk about social movement. And indeed, I think this afternoon, Professor Van Dijk has shown us how to conduct cross-disciplinary research and how to have dialogue with scholars from other disciplines. And he has clarified different kind of definitions, concepts and also introduce many analytical tools. And also, I think what is more important is he has broadened our horizon. He led us into a much bigger and much more wonderful world reality, the real world that as linguists, we need to look at and we need to address those social concerns. Yeah, so I'm very grateful for this talk. And with this talk, Professor Van Dijk is actually initiating a tiny social movement that is to show respect for students' efforts and time, and also to encourage dialogue between the speaker and the audience. And just now, some of my friends reminded me that I did not have self-introduction before my chairing. And while that was kind of intentional because I very much try to align with Professor Van Dijk for his social movement, that I would like to background myself, because it doesn't matter who I am, but it matters a lot. I would like to give the floor to my students who have did the hard work. Yes. So thank you so much for your time. And also I strongly, and I'm sharing on the screen with the center, Professor Van Dijk has mentioned just now, and there are lots of resources here, and also there are visiting opportunities. So just go to explore by yourself. And thank you very much for your time, and for everyone, and for Professor Van Dijk's time. Very grateful for this. It's our great honor and privilege to have this inspiring talk. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you also again. I never learned. I had, just to finish this, unfortunately, I never had time to learn at least a little bit of Chinese, although my last classes of MA students here in Barcelona, of 55 students, 20 were students from China. So I wish I had time to learn a little bit more saying ni hao and xie xie, and many other words. But I already had to learn many other languages, and I will only have to speak Spanish here. With my wife, who's from Brazil, I have to speak Portuguese. Now I have to speak English and write in English. And of course, I'm Dutch, so I have my children, I speak Dutch. And at school, we also had French and German and so on. And I lived in France and in Germany, so I had to learn these languages too. And also Scandinavian languages. So I guess my head is full of other languages. There's no space even to speak. And I should actually, here in Catalonia, speak more Catalan. I can understand and I can read it, but speak it quickly. So there's simply in my head, which is already 81 years old, there's no space for more languages, and there's no time to learn more Chinese. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. We truly appreciate your effort of trying to pronounce our name. That is another type of social movement, because normally when we communicate with foreigners, we will ask, what's your English name? And then so we say, well, I don't have an English name. My Chinese name is my name. Yeah, so that is